Welcome, everyone, to Christian Formation, coming to you from Church the Redeemer in Sarasota, and to the series, an ongoing series called The Moral Courage of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is session 7, which focuses on King and economic justice. In the last session, number 6, the focus was on King in Vietnam and how King changed his mind in 1967 and opposed the war in Vietnam for the first time publicly. Economic justice, the topic of this session, came into public limelight again in 1967 because of events that occurred in the years 1965 and 1966, and through the discussion of planning of what would eventually be called the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. In fact, the famous I Have a Dream speech from 1963, that demonstration or gathering really was about jobs, and the dream speech was just simply part of a number of speeches. King's change in his thinking about Vietnam, coupled with his renewed focus on economic justice, I think required him to take new directions in his efforts to what he certainly wanted to do, was to change America. In the summer of 1965, in several northern American cities, riots occurred, including in the Watts Ghetto of Los Angeles, where 35 people were killed. In August of 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Johnson. Blacks now had the right to vote and therefore the power to bring about change. And I've said this before, and it's very true. King had always thought that any oppressed people, whether in our own country or others, had to take some responsibility themselves for getting out of their oppression. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave Southern blacks that power to really begin to do that, take more control of their lives. At this point in time, I think King reflected and recognized that the freedom movement, we know it as the Civil Rights Movement, but originally it was called the Freedom Movement, begun in the South, had laid the foundation for a much broader and deeper movement on behalf of blacks, a national movement that would go beyond just voting rights. In 1966, King went north to Chicago to establish his Chicago Freedom Movement. Notice it's the Chicago Freedom Movement now, a campaign to confront the injustice of discriminatory real estate practices, the most well-known being a practice which many of us have heard of called redlining. Redlining is the practice of banks and insurance firms refusing to issue or insure mortgage loans in predominantly black neighborhoods, which would often be shown on city maps actually with a red line drawn in. These discriminatory practices kept blacks boxed inside these big city ghettos, practices which amounted to legalized racial discrimination in housing. Ghettos were the legacy of the Great Migration earlier in the 20th century, when millions of Southern blacks moved to Chicago and other northern cities. In Chicago, black families began to settle in a part of the near South Side, that later was nicknamed Bronzeville. By the time King came to Chicago in 1966, after some initial planning, population density in this section called Bronzeville was at least 84,000 people per square mile, compared to only 27,000 outside of it. So I think we can all see the problem. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, years later, reflected on King in Chicago, and I want to read a portion of his reflection because I think it catches where the movement was at this point in time. The program at the time was to prove several things. We came here, meaning Chicago, with a nonviolent experiment to prove that problems in the North were just as pervasive and clear as those in the South. We found Ciceros up here and Gage Parks here, and we found Daley's here, referring to the mayor of Chicago. We found that the organization was much more sophisticated and that the enemy was black and white people who were of a certain mind, as opposed, say, to just the white people of the South. Here the enemy was not only the redneck, sometimes it was the blackface. It was all those forces that represented the self-interest of perpetuating, and this is Jackson's term, the evil machine. Then it was said that all black people in the North would never have the discipline to engage in this mass nonviolent movement. Well, obviously that was proven to be wrong because some of the most disciplined movements that we had occurred in Chicago. The great effect of the Northern movement was to wake up Northern black America. That they had a problem. It wasn't just a matter of coming down south. They needed to come back home and do homework. Now, Dr. King said it would take from 3 to 5 years for a sustained nonviolent movement to begin to change the thing. The newspapers, in their impatience, wanted to make it a 3 to 5 month movement, the media. But it was a 3 to 5 year movement, and as a result of raising certain basic truths in the Chicago movement, Gary, Indiana, Newark, New Jersey, and Cleveland, Ohio, and other cities began to reassess their political power and political consciousness. The rock hit the water here, but the concentric circles shot right across Northern America. So I think that the movement was successful. Jesse Jackson. So, during the summer of 1966, the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was King's first major campaign outside of the Deep South, organized many demonstrations and marches into all-white neighborhoods. These demonstrations and marches triggered open violence by whites. The most famous violent demonstration occurred in Marquette Park, where King was attacked by an angry mob. I have some photos here of some of this I wanted to show you. First of all, when King moved north for this, they moved in January, and King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, actually rented a cold water flat in Chicago to become part of the neighborhood. So we have, this is kind of a publicity photo, but it gives you a flavor. There's Coretta Scott King sweeping up in this place, and there's Martin Luther King actually doing some, looks like he's got a hammer, he's doing some repairs to the place, but they actually moved into the neighborhood. And now, some other photos. Here's a picture of King in a neighborhood pool hall, and the reason he's in the pool hall because he's trying to fit himself into the neighborhood and get to know people. So you can see him. I'm going to have to stand up to show you this, but that's all right. You can see him playing pool, and most of the people surrounding him are young, which of course he was very pleased with. And then here's a picture of some of the violence that occurred during the demonstrations. You can see there the one picture with the bare-chested guy. He's already been touched with a bayonet and he's bleeding. And there's another guy being taken off by police. And then we have, I think, one more. Yeah, this is the one where King was actually hit by a rock. You can see him bending down. It occurred just then. So that was Chicago in summer of 1966. All of the publicity about this campaign during the summer of 1966 amid the dramatic marches ended with what was criticized by some as, and this is a quote, a shaky truce between King's forces and Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley's coalition of white civic and business leaders. In a nutshell, after all of this that went on during the summer, what was agreed to was this, and it was called the Summit Agreement. That's simple, Summit Agreement. Was that King would agree to cancel any more marches against Chicago. Chicago pledged to try to do more to make housing open and fair. The Real Estate Board pledged to stop opposing state housing legislation. They were trying to hold on to what the old ways. And the bankers agreed to lend money to qualified home buyers regardless of their race. The Summit Agreement, called an agreement, but it was not legally enforceable. Many black leaders in Chicago thought it was equivalent to surrender. King declared the agreement basically satisfactory to him, feeling that if the agreement was honored, it would provide a strong equal housing program in Chicago. Now, it was not honored in the way that he intended it to be, but that was his, you could call it his dream about Chicago. King, and here comes the moral courage part. King, now towards the end of his life, although he did not know that, faces a crossroads once again. As he did over the Vietnam War, knowing what he knows, that America's racial injustices are, in a broader sense, also America's economic injustices, which road to take? King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which he led, having accomplished what they set out to do as the freedom movement, again, we call it the Civil Rights Movement, through nonviolent demonstrations and legal action, set free the blacks of the Deep South from the yoke of segregation, or at least the start of it. Was that enough? That's the question that King has to confront. Or were King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference called to a greater nationwide movement to end the yoke of economic injustice? In this series, I've been using a fairly simple definition of moral courage in relation to King. And it's this: as a Christian and as a Christian pastor, what was he called to do as the right behavior to persevere in the face of danger and difficulties, in the face of injustices? And does he have this moral courage to say yes to the call of history? So many of the things that King got involved with, we're talking now in terms of the timeline here in the South, he was drawn into. But I think he recognized, as I said in one of the earlier sessions, he was called to do this. Does he have the moral courage to say yes to the call of history? King did not, and I believe he could not have said no. But in saying yes, what then were they to do? King's most pressing concern was how he and the movement could pursue the economic justice issues which increasingly had preoccupied him. As was true in all of King's and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's major campaigns, there developed a series of ongoing, what were called retreats, involving the Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff and then outside people who were invited to come in as well. And what would occur there would be an offering of competing arguments about how to bring this broader issue of economic justice to the North. At these retreats, King mostly listened, and I think that's why he organized. The retreats occurred over several months while King's opposition to the Vietnam War continued, with King crisscrossing the nation, giving speeches, sermons, and support to the anti-war movement, all the while living out of a suitcase. He was constantly traveling. And when he was paid to speak, much of that money, if not almost all of it, went to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was said at this time that he was often visibly physically exhausted and at times depressed. It was a troubling time for King. I think it could be described, at least at this point in time, as he was almost in despair. He was angry at how the increasing resources needed for the ever-expanding Vietnam War took resources away from President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. He was angry because the Vietnam War and the protests for and against it were occupying and more the media's and therefore the public's attention, with less and less of a public concerned about civil rights, let alone any new initiative focusing on economic justice. Let me now share some, some quotes of what King said himself about the situation in the United States in 1966 and as it turned into 1967. And these are coming from David Garrell's excellent one-volume biography of King called Bearing the Cross. King indicated how troubled he had become, and I quote King here: "We are gravely mistaken to think that religion protects us from the pain and agony of mortal existence. Life is not a euphoria of unalloyed comfort and untroubled ease. Christianity has always insisted that the cross we bear precedes the crown we wear. To be a Christian, one must take up his cross with all its difficulties and agonizing and tension packed content and carry it until that very cross leaves its mark upon us and redeems us to that more excellent way which comes only through suffering. King also said America's greatest problem and contradiction is that it harbors 35 million poor at a time when its resources are so vast that the existence of poverty is an anachronism. The Negro is not moving too fast, he's barely moving. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference would undertake 3 urgent programs as a result of these retreats I mentioned. One was political reformation of the South, the reconstruction of youth through meaningful training and education. Here's the most important one, the one we're talking about in this session. The organizing of the poor in a crusade to reform society in order to realize economic and social justice. And then one more quote. King said, "I am not ready to accept defeat. We must formulate a program and we must fashion the new tactics which do not count on government goodwill, but instead serve to compel unwilling authorities to yield to the mandates of justice. Nonviolence must be adapted to urban conditions and urban moods. Nonviolent protests must now mature to a new level, mass civil disobedience. There must be more than a statement to the larger society. There must be a force that interrupts its functioning at some key point. The Negro will be saying, I am willing to endure all your punishment because your society will not be able to endure the stigma of violently and publicly oppressing its minority to preserve injustice." Well, the next session in this series, The Moral Courage of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., will cover the Poor People's Campaign and King's assassination, which I've entitled Requiem in Memphis. And the date for that is to be determined. Thank you for watching, and I hope, at least in some small way, through this series, I've planted a seed in you that will germinate into an increased interest in you to read history. Thanks again.